morning, everyone, and welcome to today's training. I'm Hannah Hickam, the Executive Assistant, and I'll be your host for today. We always start off with a Q&A, so you can either raise your hand or put in the chat function your questions from the last few presentations, and we will have somebody answer those. So I'll give folks a few minutes to do that. This is explaining how you can raise your hand. You go to the participants box, click the three dots and then click raise hand, or the chat box is right next to the participant box usually. And you bring up this toolbar by just like moving your mouse around. It should either show up on the top or the bottom of your screen. Mine shows up at the top, but I've also had it show up at the bottom. Great, it looks like we've already got some questions, so just keep those coming in for the first few minutes.
Jane, do you want to take that first question?
Yep, but I'm going to wait till the numbers stop climbing.
Oh, good call.
Right?
Yes, good call. I always like to rush right into things, but that's awfully kind of you to wait for everyone, Jane. Thank you.
Well, I'm not going to wait for everyone, but I'll wait for some folks.
The bulk of everyone.
It takes me more than 2 minutes to get to a meeting. You know, it's a funny thing that our attendance on Thursdays is always quite a bit smaller than our attendance on Tuesdays. I don't know.
Jane, it looks like it might have leveled off at about 150.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm Jane Stanzik, Permitting Manager, and I'm going to answer this question. While we understand paper forms are no longer accepted as a submittal for many things, is it possible to still have blank PDFs on the website to be able to use as a reference when preparing a form or helping someone gather info? Maybe add a watermark of do not submit. You know, that's a great suggestion. We'll think about it. You know, what I do when I want a blank PDF of a form is I log into eForms, I hit create new form, and then I just use that print preview once you're in whatever form it is, even if it's just a blank. I use the print preview and get a nice PDF. And I know that's a couple other steps, and we'll consider putting PDFs back out on that forms page, but it's troublesome because people think they can fill them out and email them to staff. So we'll consider. Scott's shaking his head no. Okay, the next one, I think that's you, Gregory.
Thanks, Jane. Greg Duranlo, Environmental Manager. The next question is, when will the Commission's information sheets be available in order for operators to be able to provide notice to the relevant and proximate local governments of the 30-day application? So the OGA staff and hearings unit, and as well as engineering on one of them, are still working on those documents and finalizing them. And in the meantime, it is possible local governments may affirmatively waive the requirements to receive those bits. And those information sheets are really, more intended for the general public. Most local governments who are engaged in oil and gas permitting in their own jurisdictions are well aware of the information that is and will be contained in those. So talk to your local government representative, see if they will affirmatively waive that, and that could actually be submitted with your application to us, a waiver of that. They would still need to be noticed, but they just wouldn't need to have those information sheets attached to the notice. So hopefully that helps. The next question is also for me. When will the public water system protection shapefiles be finalized in GIS? It still says draft SB 19-181 in Rule 411. And so there's two sets of shapefiles that we're working with. The first set of shapefiles are the surface public water system surface water intakes. For the time being, continue to use the Rule 317B shapefiles. They will show close enough the classified water segments 5 miles upstream from the PWS intake, and they still show the half-mile buffer. The internal boundaries within those are where those aren't going to be as effective. But those determinations, the map is not the end-all determinant for which buffer zone your proposed location is. Ultimately, it's conducting a evaluation of your location and determining what the ordinary high water mark is, and making that measurement off the ordinary high water mark. And we know that those 317B buffers did not always exactly track the high water mark anyway, so that's not a new program there. We do expect that there will be a few more public water system surface water intakes come into the system, and you can our partners at CDPHE Water Quality Control Division manage those in their source water protection program. And so you can work with CDPHE to find those if you suspect that there might be one near your proposed location. Until we get that information solidified from them, though, we don't have it. The second set of data is the GUI, groundwater under direct influence of surface water, and type 3 aquifers. And the way we've buffered those on the map with the quarter sections shaded is going to be the way that we ultimately do that. And so you can continue to use those layers that are available on our website. If you are, when you do propose the location, and you're reviewing the water well information around it, if you see something that looks like a municipal water well owner, you might want to contact them proactively if it's not included in one of our buffers. Next question might be in my wheelhouse also. Two questions. We'll take them one at a time. In our call with CPW yesterday, CPW informed us it was their understanding, excuse me, that even if we have an approved 2A and 2s from 2020, we are still subject to 2021 regulations to meet standards of director and COGCC staff expectations along with CPW discussions. CPW stated if an operator has not started construction on a permit before January 15th, the permits are subject to director review. CPW also recommended I ask the specific question to COGCC. And okay, so Rule 1202C is operational. It states no ground disturbance in these areas shall occur after January 15th. So if you have a permit for a location that is now it's approved and unbuilt, and it is the location, please reach out directly to OGLA staff or myself. That we will have to talk about those. If it is in any of the other high priority habitats other than 1202C1 list, then those rules were written prospectively to permitting new locations. So you don't need to come in and have a discussion about the compensatory mitigation for mule deer habitat, for example, because that range has shifted and your approved unbuilt location is now included in that habitat. 1202C, again, was an operationally written rule. And then the second question in this is regards to the approved 2As and 2s that we have before January 15th. Are they subject to the 2021 facility requirements? So I'm presuming that's the 600 series facility requirements. And yes, if you are constructing a new facility, you need to build it in accordance with the standards that are in place. That is the way those rules were written. Again, they were written to be operational. This SB 19181 included the clause at the very end that said these changes apply to all conduct, and so anything that is operational, we are applying the new rules to. Jane?
So Hannah and I got a private question, but it really applies to everybody. So the question once again is, eForms has been extremely unstable lately when attempting to file old and new forms. Who are the best contacts when experiencing these issues? Just send me an email. I'll pass it along to our IT folks. We're just continuing to fight that battle, unfortunately. And thank you for your patience.
And I think the next question might be yours as well, Jane, about edits to the eForm.
When edits of any time, so our revisions to the forms, yes, I think that we have to date told you when we released revised versions of the forms. We had a slide a couple of weeks ago we had a slide on January 14th and said, here's all the forms that revisions are going to be released on January 15th. We will continue to do that. In fact, Sabrina's going to talk about some revisions to the Form 2C. So you'll know, and we'll let you know when we release a revision to an existing form to comply with emission change rules. I hope that answers your question. And so then here's another question. While creating blanks in eForms is one option of getting the info, what would you recommend for people who are trying to support operators but aren't their designated and don't have access to eForms? Well, typically our instructions, our form instructions have screenshots of the data fields, and our checklist lists all the data fields. So as we get those updated and out there, I think that that's a great place. In fact, if you're supporting somebody, you need to be looking at the checklist for the particular form. And I know we don't have them all out there. We're working on it. Gregory, you're muted, dude.
In the interim Form 2B, the mitigation measures tab instructions say to describe the mitigation measures and choose one resource from the list. But when a mitigation measure will affect multiple resources, should we select more than one resource or list the same mitigation multiple times, but under each affected resource? I believe our intent on that is that you would list it multiple times for each resource. And that way, because that way, when we're sort of collecting the data and on an annual basis and looking at more than just one form, we can see how many times those were used and for what affected resource. So for now, let's go ahead and list them individually, even though I know that may seem a little bit redundant. I think it will provide us with better data over the long haul. Next question is a follow-up to earlier question about the information sheets. The required info sheets for notice, you stated you are still working on them. You also stated local government can waive this requirement for them, but operators still need to send these to the public. Is there a workaround on sending them to the public until they are ready? This would hold up notice process or no, if there's no workaround. So they are not required to be sent to the public until COGCC makes its completeness determination. So we intend to have them out before we are making our first completeness determination on the first when they will be necessary. So we are working on those. They're a priority, and like many other priorities, they're just not ready yet. Thank you. And then the next question is, does the HPH data set on COGCC website always take primacy over CPW updates that have not yet been approved by COGCC and added to the website? Yeah, so that's a great question. We did mention in our last training, Taylor and I, that CPW will be making sort of their most current HPH data available on their website. We think that's a great tool and resource for operators to use when planning locations. However, the maps that are on COGCC's GIS online interactive map are the rule. Those are what the commission adopted when they adopted the high priority habitats. So until a rulemaking changes those, they are the rule. We think planning with the more current, let's say there's new raptor nests that are mapped, or let's say a tree has fallen down. We think using those tools to plan is appropriate.
So can I add just one thing to my answer about what do you do if you have an e-form problem? Yes, send me an email. And the thing that is so helpful when I pass the problem along to our folks that actually fix it is if you get an error message, put a snip of that error message in the email and include the actual document number that you were working on when you got that error, because that is so valuable information to help our guys figure out what the problem is. Super, super helpful for them. So please do that. That's it. Thanks.
Okay, if that is it.
That's
Oh,
not
go ahead.
it. There's one. In the interim Form 2B, item 67 regarding the distance from the edge of the working pad surface to the listed HPH, is the distance measured to the actual HPH feature, i.e. raptor nest or the associated buffer? it would be the associated buffer, because HPH is high priority habitat. So it's not just the nest, it is the habitat around the nest. And if you are within that habitat, I'm not sure if that's the data field where you would enter 0, but there is a place for that as well. Now, Hannah, you want to kick us to the next? If any further questions come in, we can pick them up at the end.
Oh, certainly. Thank you. Yes, next up, we actually have you, Greg,
Right.
from the Form 2A BMPs. And you can take that away. I think that was just an announcement. You don't have a presentation. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I don't have a presentation. So staff has been reviewing, our processes and practices over the past several years and looking at what those practices will be going forward. And so OGLA staff is going to be revising its approach on BMPs with respect to the Form 2A. And so this kind of represents a significant change. We think it will improve efficiency overall. Rule 304B11 requires BMPs as commitments by the operator to be placed on the Form 2A. It does not specify how they are placed on the Form 2A. And we have implemented the BMP tab where operators can add a row, select a BMP type, write the BMP. 304C requires numerous plans attached to the Form 2A. And many of those are when you go to the referred rule, many of those require that BMPs are included in the plans. So what we think this does is this creates a potential for conflict and inconsistencies. A BMP on the plan isn't written exactly the same as the BMP on the Form 2A, and things don't line up. So in order to remedy that, we're going to ask operators not to place BMPs directly on the Form 2A. And that's the change. Instead, we would like to see the detailed site-specific BMPs included in a list in your respective plans. And one BMP may function for multiple plans. If it's a odor related, it might be a waste management related. So it could maybe reside in multiple plans. And then during our technical review, COGCC staff will pull the appropriate BMPs from the plans and put them on the Form 2A. And that will be sort of our affirmation of, we've read the plan, we've reviewed it, we agree that this BMP is acceptable to indicate how the plan will be complied, how the plan will be implemented and how the rules will be complied with. We copy, paste that onto the 2A. That way, if there's any negotiation about a plan or a BMP within a plan, that can all be done just on that plan by plan basis. And then we can swap out, if the plan needs to be modified and the BMP needs to be modified, we swap out the plan and then copy and paste the BMP into the Form 2A. And that way we don't have the same BMP in two places. It gets updated in one and not the other, and then we have a conflict. The BMPs and COAs are readily available to folks who are working offline, field inspectors and environmental protection specialists out in the field. They're available through the Scout card, whereas the plans are not. We don't have necessarily access to all the documents when we are working remotely. So it's really important that those BMPs are on the Form 2A as the rule requires, but the plans represent sort of more of a permitting review of how operations are going to be conducted. And we are working on draft guidance. I'm actually hoping that we can have draft guidance on this ready for a first release by the end of the day tomorrow. And so I recognize that that's a change. I'm hoping that that really will improve the efficiency. So more to come on that. And I see there's some questions coming in, as well as my sound is cutting out again. So I'll try and hold my mic up. I'm going to actually hold questions on that until we get the guidance out, and then I think it will be more appropriate. So
there were just a couple of questions, Greg, that I think we can address right now.
oh, okay.
The next question that we hadn't addressed was the fees question, and if the commission, when the commission holds a fee rulemaking, it will have an effective date, and then only applications after that date that have been designated a fee will be subject to that fee. I don't know of an administrative process whereby they could retroactively request a fee for something before the effective date of a fee. I'm 99.9% sure on that answer, but I'm never perfect. And then Greg, you had one. Now, if I'm understanding correctly, COGCC will pull from our SWMP or the OGDP plan regarding the BMPs.
So we will pull appropriate and necessary BMPs from any of the attached plans required by 304C. And we will make that determination whether the BMP needs to be included on the Form 2A or can continue to reside within the plan, or whether it needs to be addressed with a condition of approval. That's, we would recommend that the commission adopt if they approve the permit.
Thanks. Back to you, Hannah.
And
All
I
right.
think Hannah's going to kick it right back to me, right?
I am. Greg is going to introduce the wildlife consultation liaison. So go ahead, Greg, and take that away. And then when the next person comes up, I'll pull their presentation up.
Great. Thanks, Hannah. And today, again, I'll actually be presenting also with our partners from Colorado Parks and Wildlife regarding the Wildlife Resource Tab, the consultation processes, and compensatory mitigation. Consistent with our expectations for pre-application consultation, before we actually look at the Form 2A Wildlife Resources tab, which I'll walk through, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to CPW to discuss the process for wildlife consultations. And you all met Taylor Elm last week, but as a reminder, Taylor is the CPW Energy Liaison for the Northwest region, and he's been active with the program of wildlife consultations for oil and gas development for the past 8 years. And please continue to chat in your questions. We'll circle back and make sure we answer them all after our combined presentation. So Taylor, if you're ready to take it away, go for it.
Sure. Thanks, Greg and Hannah. Good morning, everybody. As Greg mentioned, I'm the CPW Energy Liaison in the Northwest region. And just wanted to set the stage this morning with a very brief and kind of high-level perspective from CPW regarding wildlife consultations, specifically, again, very high-level, what's changed, kind of what's staying the same, and then some keys for successful consultations going forward. As Greg mentioned, there's going to be some more detailed discussions forthcoming this morning and later, and then also some additional details in some future guidance documents to be released. Next slide, Hannah. All right, so I thought it was important to note that really going forward, wildlife consultations with CPW should largely still be the same. The structure should still be similar. For operators that have worked with us over the last few years successfully, I think they'll find that our concerns and our approach to these consultations really are still the same as we work through some of the concepts in the new rules. Important to note that CPW mapped wildlife habitats are still the trigger for the formal consultation with CPW. That's the same in the past. Admittedly, there are some new species and habitats in the rules now that you haven't seen, haven't worked with in the past. And so depending on where you operate, I think there will be some new discussions regarding those new species and habitats, and maybe a little bit of a learning curve there, but I think it's definitely something we can work through. I think you've heard this from CPW 1,000 times now, but in our opinion, the early communication is key. Having discussions and opportunities to review stuff early on is really important to us. And it boils down to this, this term or this concept of pre-consultations. And although pre-consultations are not required in the rules, we would highly recommend it where you can, and think it's very beneficial to operators, and then to us from the wildlife protection standpoint as well. And just some bullet points here on that. It potentially saves time and efficiency when you're submitting permit applications. If we've had those discussions up front and worked through some of those details, you're going to have that information, such as best management practices that might be applicable, conversations around that, and other information that might go into some of the plans. We'll have already talked about that, and you'll have a pretty good feeling. So I think it'll be more efficient when you're kind of building that application. I think there's potential to save money too. I think from our standpoint, we always want to kind of get out on site and take a look at a location, but we don't necessarily have to have that location completely staked out and surveyed and have plats available. And so if we can get out there and kind of look at conceptual locations before you've sunk that money, I think there's some cost savings there, instead of kind of that dreaded situation where all that work's occurred and then it's evident that maybe a pad has to be shifted or an access road, something like that. Also, in the structure of the new rules, kind of this concept of CPW waivers where appropriate, where we have discretion on some of the aspects to provide written waivers. Those discussions can take place where it's appropriate, and then you can have that written agreement from CPW to submit with the permit application. And then finally, this concept of alternative location analysis for wildlife. Those discussions would obviously be important during a pre-consultation, and looking at any way we can avoid impacts by maybe moving the location outside of high priority habitat. But I also wanted to note that almost equally important is, we know that in a lot of areas it's not going to be possible to get outside of high priority habitat. And so in those instances, just moving a location slightly within that high priority habitat to take advantage of topography or vegetation to help screen and minimize some of the impacts could be very important as well. And we can have those discussions. And then just a little plug too, I'll note that, as I said, we like getting out and seeing the locations in person. Desktop analysis is also important, but getting out there, you can't beat seeing something in person. And while we're out there, if we're doing an on-site, if there's some other locations in the area, even if they're just future, maybe at that time pie in the sky kind of locations, let's go ahead and take a look at them. Anything that we can do, get out there, snap some photos, take some GIS or GPS points. I think that just further streamlines communications in the future if one of those locations comes to fruition and you're looking at permitting it in the future. So I'll just throw that out there. Next slide, Hannah. So what has changed specifically? Obviously, this slide is not a comprehensive list of all the changes related to wildlife and wildlife consultations. But keeping this high level, I did want to just touch on these 3 bullet points on this slide. Specifically on these first 2 regarding wildlife plans. As I mentioned, there will be some more information, more details coming out of what to be included in these plans and kind of the framework and intent for these coming out in a guidance document. But I did want to make a note on these 2. And first off, this wildlife protection plan. This is a new concept, a new term that wasn't in the old rules, but I wouldn't stress out about this one too much. In our opinion, this is meant to be a pretty simple document, a simple process that primarily outlines the adherence to the statewide operating requirements listed under Rule 1202A. And also along those lines, any exceptions or waivers that have been granted were appropriate to any of those statewide operating requirements, and kind of an explanation as to why that was appropriate, and maybe CPW concurrence or information. And I will note too, I think that within the Wildlife Protection Plan, this is a good opportunity to document if an alternative location analysis has resulted in a location being shifted outside of a high priority habitat, and therefore requiring a wildlife protection plan instead of a wildlife mitigation plan. I think here, you can document that legwork that occurred to move the location, and kind of show your work and the effort that went into that process. Wildlife mitigation plan. This plan was included in the old rules. We've worked with several operators to develop wildlife mitigation plans. I think the differences that I wanted to point out to operators that are familiar with these in the old rules is now these wildlife mitigation plans can apply to a single location. And also these wildlife mitigation plans are now required for locations within high priority habitats. And this is different. In the past, these plans have been more landscape scale in nature and have been voluntary agreements between an operator and CPW. And because of these factors, I put in parentheses here, I think these plans are going to be highly dynamic based on the circumstances of individual development plans and proposals. For example, I was thinking obviously a single location within sage-grouse general habitat is going to have quite a bit different wildlife mitigation plan than a landscape scale plan that incorporates 20 locations to be built over the next 5 years in an area that maybe contains 5 different high priority habitat layers. That being said, I don't want to steer anybody away from that landscape scale, because I think that's really where a lot of efficiencies exist to analyze multiple locations under a single pad, do that legwork up front, and then kind of be set on those locations going forward. So last bullet point here, obviously in the rules, the timeline for the official CPW consultation has changed to 60 days. From when CPW receives the permit application. And important to note that CPW receives the permit application after COGCC staff has passed the completeness determination, is when we get the email notification and the clock starts on that 60-day consultation window. And I just wanted to note on that CPW staff does not anticipate needing a full 60 days on most of these wildlife consultations. This was really to allow some room or some extra time when more complex circumstances exist and we need to have some lengthier discussions, maybe on indirect impacts or an operator proposed mitigation project, that we just need a little bit more time to hash out some of those details. So I wanted to make note of that. Next slide. So this is my last slide here. Just some tips or things to consider. A few of these are kind of just to kind of frame the mindset of what a wildlife manager is thinking about as we're reviewing some kind of development proposal. And first off, as we did kind of go through last week, I think it's important to really, from a wildlife standpoint, check those HPH layers that are present in your area. And that just sets the mindset, helps wrap your head around what some of those future discussions might be. If the primary HPH is mule deer severe winter range, obviously we're probably going to be bringing up things like timing of the operations and maybe some actions to enhance some of that winter range habitat. So I think that's an important first step. Also, in the vein of that, early communications and pre-consultations, let's make sure that are the appropriate parties involved that need to be involved at that stage. The landowner obviously plays a huge part in that. Do we need BLM at the table at that time? What county are we in? Do we need that local government designee present in the discussions at that time? So another thing to consider. As I touched on earlier, multiple locations in a larger landscape scale wildlife mitigation plan. I think there's a lot of efficiencies there and something to consider if it lends itself to your operation. You know, can you utilize existing infrastructure to minimize disturbance and impacts? This is always a win for us. I'm sure anybody who's done a consultation with us has heard, well, why can't these wells be drilled on that pad that's over the hill? And we understand they maybe can, they maybe can't, but let's always keep that in mind. And then kind of along those lines, how can we develop the resource and minimize the density of facilities? So, you know, as you're planning out a development, minimizing density of pads and access roads through directional drilling and using the existing infrastructure is always something that we think about as we're coming to the table in these discussions. Next slide. Oh, and that was it. Thanks, everybody. Feel free, as always, to reach out to your CPW Regional Energy Liaison with questions. And as we get into some of these discussions going forward, our contact information is posted on COGCC's website. And you can also find it through the COGCC GIS online interactive mapping tool. And with that, I will pass it back to Greg with some more information on the Wildlife Resources tab.
Thank you, Taylor. Appreciate that presentation, and thanks. I'm glad to see some questions coming in, and we will circle back to those at the end. And yep, Hannah, if you want to pull that one up, super. All right, so jumping in, we're going to start with the first tab on the Form 2A, which is the Consultation and Contact Information tab. So Hannah, go ahead and next slide. The two check boxes here, this is the first tab on the 2A, and these check boxes here indicate that a consultation with CPW is necessary for this Form 2A. So if either of these are checked, a consultation task for CPW will be automatically opened when the form passes completeness, and the energy liaison will get that email that Taylor mentioned. And the consultation period again is 60 days from that time. I want to point out that the language of the first question on this has been changed from a kind of a generic is the location in HPH, and now it refers specifically to the three subparts of 309E2 for which consultation is required. Next slide, please. In the checklist, we have further described those three subparts in the what it is or what is this column. And you will find that there are specific checkboxes for each subpart on the Wildlife Resources tab, and I will jump right to those now with the next slide, please. And so outlined here, the first three checkboxes explicitly ask about the applicability of Rule 309E2 A, B, and C. So the first question is the location within high priority habitat? Also included is a state park or CPW-owned state wildlife area. Second question is the location within a federally designated critical habitat or an area with known occurrence for federal or state T&E species, threatened and endangered species. And then the third question is the location and conservation easement established for wildlife habitat. All of these questions, if checked, require a consultation, and if any of these are checked, the box mentioned on the previous tab must also be checked. But only that box triggers the eForm system to activate the consultation task. So if you check a box on this and don't check the other, CPW wouldn't be alerted to your needs for a consultation. And so this is an item that staff will check during the completeness review to make sure if one of these is checked, the other is checked. And then these questions all refer to the new access roads and utility pipeline corridors as well, not just the oil and gas location. So if you are constructing a road that goes through high priority habitat, even if your location is situated out of it, you'd still check that first box. And then again, we've used oil and gas location here specifically instead of working pad surface because the entire surface disturbance has the potential to impact habitat, either through direct or indirect impacts. Next slide, please, Hannah. And that's just moving down to the next three check boxes. And these are all used to indicate that although the location is within high priority habitat or a setting described in the previous three questions, consultation is not required by rule because the location was already considered through an oil and gas development plan process that included one of the three types of plans that Taylor mentioned to avoid or minimize adverse impacts. So if one of these boxes is checked, we would expect that one or more of the first three check boxes is checked, and we would expect the Form 2A to be a refile or an amendment. And next slide, please. And this final data field on the upper section of this tab is an indication if and when a pre-application consultation was held with CPW. So you would check the box, and if you check the box, you must include a date. If there were multiple consultations, like there was a consultation with the federal land managers and the local government couldn't make it, so CPW went out again with the local government, and then the surface owner wanted to have another discussion, and you'd put the most recent consultation, pre-application consultation date. But anyway, that date is required. Next slide, please. I'm going to kind of cruise through the checklist here, and I know the Form 2A checklist is not complete and released, I believe. So I've included portions of the checklist here in this presentation, so you'll have access to it with the PDF that's posted for this. So next slide, Hannah. And next slide again. And there we are, back to the tab. So the next major section of the Wildlife Resources tab is for indicating if any CPW waivers were obtained or exceptions applied to the Form 2A. So the rules provide a number of circumstances in which CPW may waive. Typically, that waiver will be obtained during pre-application consultation. CPW may waive requirements from consultation or specific operating or siting requirements. If any waivers have been obtained, they must be attached to the Form 2A. So again, a completeness check. If we saw one of these boxes checked, we would look for that waiver to be attached. So if the waivers are still in process, it wouldn't be appropriate to check the box. We would work through that in consultation. CPW, the first one refers to the CPW waiver for the requirements of a alternative location analysis. And it should be noted that CPW can only waive the requirement to complete an ALA with respect to the siting within high priority habitat, not for other rule-based triggers for the ALA. And I think that's obvious, but I also think it's worth stating. If there are other triggers to an ALA, the ALA must still be completed, and the waiver from CPW would allow the operator to basically remove wildlife resources from their ALA siting considerations. And then the last checkbox on this tab indicates the operator is seeking an exception from compensatory mitigation, which is allowed by Rule 1203A3. The director may grant an exception for the direct and indirect mitigation requirements based on consultation with CPW. And next slide, Hannah, I think I've got a few more business checklist slides, so we can click through those. And okay, so this one, the next section, this section on the Wildlife Resources tab is a data grid, which most of you are familiar with using. And this data grid is used to identify the 1202C1 and 1202D habitats in which the oil and gas location, access road, or utility or pipeline corridor are proposed. So the data grid allows you to add as many rows as are necessary, and then requires you to identify which portion of the disturbance associated with Form 2A is encroaching. So if it's just the oil and gas location and the road is outside of the habitat, then you would just select the first box in the row. If it's the location and the road, you would select both of those. If it's just the road and not the location, you can indicate all of that. Next slide. And one more, that's just the checklist for the data grid. And so below the data grid are sections used to describe compensatory mitigation requirements. If the 1202D species specific habitats are listed in the data grid. And so at this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brian McGee. Brian's the CPW's land use coordinator for the Southwest region of the state, and he's been actively involved in consultation with operators for oil and gas development since the inception of the House Bill 07-1298 rules. So Brian, take it away.
All right, thanks, Greg. Appreciate that. Good morning, everybody. So Jen Davis, great news. We're going to answer your question right now through this presentation. So what we're going to talk about is sort of determining the location density, the facility density in HPH habitats, and sort of when CPW may evaluate indirect impacts associated with the oil and gas development. So go ahead and next slide, Hannah. So basically, what are indirect impacts? You can look back through the statement of basis and purpose if you want to really dig into all the science behind this stuff. But basically, indirect impacts are the functional habitat loss from the activity associated with development. And so this is fragmentation. This can be behavioral modification from the animals at a distance or an area greater than the physical footprint of the disturbance. And so, so this is definitely a new concept under SB 181 and something that CPW is going to have to evaluate. And so really there's, 1203D gives CPW the opportunity to recommend to the director if adverse impacts, unavoidable adverse impacts, indirect impacts exist from the operation of these facilities. And there's two triggers. So there's we need to figure out if we can evaluate if there's a location density of less than 1 mile per square mile in those 1202D habitats. So there's 10 of those. Those are mostly the big game, winter range and migration corridor habitats, and then the sage grouse or prairie chickens production areas. And so we're going to talk about in the next slide, like how do we figure out if our location density is below 1 per square mile, and then how do we? And then the other sort of trigger on that is, we're not going to assess indirect impacts or do an think about those if our location density exceeds 5 per square mile. And so there's those two rules referenced where those are, and you can look through those. And so let's start with the first one. So how do we figure out the lower density threshold? Are we over 1 per square mile? So can we go to the next slide, please, Hannah? So here's basically, this is a screenshot from COGCC and a hypothetical situation. But what we're going to do here, and we made this a simple process for operators to determine this. So basically, you pull up COGCC and you turn on the wildlife layers of those 1202D habitats. And so those are listed out there in a separate folder on COGCC. And then you can plot your location and using the COGCC tools. And so in this example, we're also going to use not wells, we're going to use active locations. So in COGCC, there is an active or inactive location tab. So make sure you're turning that one on. And usually those active locations turn up green. They're bright green. And so you're going to want to measure, I think we can go to the next slide there, Hannah. So we can just simply measure from the active location a straight line distance to our proposed location. And if the distance is less than 1.2 miles, then your new location will exceed 1 location per square mile. And the thing to keep in mind here is we're not concerned about the section township range public land survey system square mile. These are, we've basically dissolved those artificial geographic boundaries, and we're really looking at the density of facilities within the habitat types. So everybody's going to wonder why 1.2 miles. So Hannah, can we go to the next slide? So if we use, it's based on the calculation of the area of a circle of what a square mile is when you put it in terms of a circle. And so in order to get a square mile with a circle, we have to use a radius of 0.56. And so we use 1.2 miles because we'll have this overlapping buffer, and then therefore we've exceeded the density of those facilities. So hopefully that makes sense. So actually, Hannah, can you go back to the last slide? So in this instance, in this example, you know, we used the measure tool, we measured it out. That line segment is 0.73 miles from the nearest active location. And so this, in this example, you would be going from less than 1 location per square mile to over 1 location per square mile. And that triggers CPW to say, okay, we need to start thinking about indirect impacts and what that might look like. And so then the other way is, okay, so we have so many facilities on the landscape, active locations, that at some point the indirect impacts, we can't measure them. They're wide and they're pervasive across the landscape. And so thinking about indirect impacts and offsetting indirect impacts isn't that useful for maintaining any more habitat function. So Hannah, can you click forward a couple, 2 slides? So, go back 1. So how are we going to determine the density of oil at when the density exceeds 5 per square mile? And this again applies to those 10-ish habitat types in 1202D. And so what we've done at CPW is we've developed a point density analysis in GIS, and we have all the methodology spelled out in some operator guidance that we will give you, and you can run this if you think that you're gonna potentially your new facility is going to kick you to basically that 6th location within a square mile. And so we're going to update this layer annually. It's going to be a data layer on COGCC, so you'll be able to zoom in and see and plot your location. And those locations that are on the edge of where we've already demonstrated that you've exceeded that. We can run this methodology for you during the consultation, or you can do it on your own. You'll have all those tools to do that. And Hannah, can you go to the next slide? So I know this is a very useful scale to see individually where you're at, but at a statewide scale, when we ran this model and using this methodology, this is what we come out with. So those areas those polygons that you can see that are shaded sort of olive green, those are already areas that are exceeding that threshold, and that where we wouldn't be thinking about indirect impacts and making recommendations and working with you all to sort of figure out how you can modify your operations to reduce those indirect impacts. But when this layer is on COGCC, you'll be able to zoom in and use it for planning purposes. I guess the last thing that I would point out is I'd refer you back to all the 1203 rules. So 1203D, you know, those are all the factors that CPW is going to consider when thinking about evaluating indirect impacts. We also, you know, 1203D3 basically gives direction to, what the commission could do to sort of address those impacts in terms of, are there additional projects that you could do? Are there additional fees that you could pay? And so finally, I guess all I'll say is, there's some interpretation to all of this, and your site-specific location is going to require a lot of a thought and evaluation of how these indirect impacts apply. And so to get at that and to be consistent statewide, we've developed an internal CPW team where we're going to be reviewing all of these indirect impact determinations so that we can keep consistency across the state and in between operators and with in between the CPW regions. So, and Hannah, next slide, I think that's all I have for all of you.
Great, thank you, Brian. Great job presenting. And Hannah, if you could take me back to my presentation, I'll kind of wrap up the bottom of the Wildlife Resources tab, and then we will dig into the questions that we've received. Perfect. Next slide then. So these are just the data layers here that show that track the data, I'm sorry, for the direct impacts for locations within the HPH listed in 1202D. So this is the compensatory mitigation information that Brian was just describing how you make those determinations, and then these are mostly yes or no drop downs to address these. And then our checklist for this section is still a work in progress. So we are I don't have slides on that, but next slide, please, Hannah. And so this section looks just exactly the same as the previous one. The difference is this is for the indirect impacts. So we have the direct impact section and the indirect impact section to collect that data. And so so this section may not always be able to be completed prior to submittal because the operator may not know exactly what the indirect impacts calculation is going to be, and that's actually going to be worked out during the formal consultation process. And in that case, the business rules will just kind of require that some answers are put in there, no, 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 no type of thing. And then you can use that text box to explain that you're working through the indirect impacts mitigation during the formal consultation. Next slide. And then this very last section of the Wildlife Resources tab is the operator proposed BMP's data grid. And you should all be very familiar with this as it has not changed in structure. One thing I did not mention in my earlier comment about not putting BMPs on the Form 2A are the exceptions to that process. Wildlife BMPs are one exception to that process, and our guidance document on the BMPs will lay out a few others. Because we have this data grid built and we have specific language for BMPs provided by CPW for the various species-specific habitats, we do still want you to use this BMP tool. So again, this should be familiar to you. There are a few changes in here. The first change is in the target species. We've obviously updated that to have the new species and habitats as named under the HPH. And we've also included the aquatic species to the target species list. And then the text by the modify checkbox underneath that species selection is just a reminder that says COGCC discourages the modification of the preloaded BMPs that were provided by CPW. And so, if you are checking that box to modify it, just understand that that's generally not the preferred track to take. Next, please, Hannah. So when you select the BMP type, you get these 4 different types: unknown, avoidance, minimization, and mitigation. We don't have any that are listed as unknown. That's kind of a relic. And we've removed all that were previously listed as mitigation, because now mitigation is really provided through the compensatory mitigation process. So most then of the BMPs are either avoidance BMPs or minimization BMPs. Next, please, Hannah. And so, it still functions the same way. When you click on minimization, you get the list, and then you select the number that you want, and you can go back in and select as many as you want. Some of the language has been updated just for some of the species, and some new BMPs have been added for new HPH areas, for example, the aquatics. But most of the modifications are things that CPW has been working with operators on in consultation for a while. So in reading through the list, I don't see anything that's a big surprise in there. And then one more click, Hannah, please. And then so lastly, we have added, I mentioned that we don't want the CPW provided BMPs modified, but we have added a generic BMP that can be selected for modification. So it just says, replace this text with site-specific BMP language that's been previously agreed upon by CPW during a pre-application consultation. So if you're out in the field working with CPW, you come up with an appropriate BMP, you can select this one and write it in there. You'll select as many target species and BMPs as necessary or previously agreed upon. And then CPW and COGCC will determine their applicability to the permit during the consultation, and they'll be included in the director's recommendation to the commission. And next slide, Hannah. I think that's it. So I think we do have some questions that flew in, and thanks for those. And I think the first one is to me, and I think there's 2 questions in here that are continuing to address that issue of, oops, I've lost it. The issue of approved but unbuilt locations. So 1202C only pertains to high priority habitats. So is this additional consultation with COGCC only related to wildlife issues and only in areas of high priority habitat? I'm asking about all approved location 2As and 2s. So the rule is written, so I mean, for locations approved prior to January 15th, but not yet constructed, 1202C is operational and is habitat specific. The operator will need to contact COGCC prior to construction. The rule is explicit that new ground disturbance is prohibited in 1202C1 habitat. Since these locations were approved prior to 115, they're not subject to the permitting wildlife rules, such as 1202D1, the density habitats, or 1203, compensatory mitigation. And then also we are working with our GIS team to understand the universe of approved unbuilt locations to which this applies. How was the density habitat layer developed? I will turn that over to CPW to answer.
I'll take that one, Greg. So again, it's a GIS model using the point density tool in ArcGIS, and we're going to give you guys some operator guidance on exactly how to run that model with the specific parameters so that you guys can do that yourselves. I hope that works.
Greg, I could add one thing on that one real quick too. If that question was kind of based on the density habitats that are outlined under Rule of 1202D, those, I think as we mentioned last week, are kind of the habitats that are known to cause the indirect impacts to those species. or I should say the indirect impacts are largely based on the density of the facilities. And you can find some of that information outlined in the statement of basis and purpose. And then as we've mentioned, there'll be some draft guidance coming out on some of the stuff that Brian talked about.
Thanks, you guys. And I apologize if I'm cutting out. My internet has informed me that it's unstable. So hopefully you can hear me. Does 1202C apply if your approved Form 2A was not initially in high priority habitat area and is now it is based on maps? Yes, 1202C is an operational rule, and if you break ground on a location in 1202C1 habitat, you're likely out of compliance. Do active locations include pending permits?
I can take that one.
Great.
For the purposes of calculating density, they do not. We're only looking at those active locations under the COGCC tab, not pending permits and not actually approved Form 2As, because those may or may not have been built yet. So we're really looking at that active location piece. If we start getting too many, we might have to rethink this if we're getting too many permits approved that will clearly push us over those density thresholds without discussing indirect impacts. But for now, that's the approach we've taken, that pending permits and approved Form 2As do not affect the density determination.
Thanks, Brian. Are off-pad midstream flow lines, oil, produced water, and gas required to submit Form 2A? Generally, I would say no. They are covered on a Form 44 if they are subject to COGCC regulatory authority, and they should be described in your Form 2A documentation as well. So, but they don't require a standalone Form 2A for a midstream company to put in a pipeline. The next question, if you are not in a HPH area, it's a CPW area, but a high priority habitat area, is there a box to mark so that we can just skip over this tab? The business rules built into the Form 2A require you to answer certain questions on the Wildlife Resource tab. Those are primarily yes or no questions that can easily be answered. But we do implement these types of business rules so that we know questions were not inadvertently overlooked if simply left blank. So it should be pretty straightforward to click no on a couple of those, and obviously you wouldn't check any of the boxes at the top. For well plugging operations, is a CPW consultation required if the well is within a 1202C, 1202D, or 309E1 area? So for plugging operations that do not require a Form 2A permit, no new consultation is required. The original wildlife-related conditions of approval regarding seasonal timing restrictions should still apply. And this has been an issue on occasion, where an operator has come into, for example, a area near raptor nests with a plugging rig or even a workover rig to do downhole work during the seasonal restrictions. We would strongly discourage that. And while a consultation is not necessary, those operations are still covered by COGCC rules, and acting, in a manner that is not protective of public health, safety, public health, safety, welfare, environment, and wildlife resources, is not in compliance with our rules. So Hannah, it looks like the questions have slowed down. Appreciate everyone bringing those in, but I think we can move on to the next topic.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Greg, and thank you, Taylor and Brian. Presentations were awesome. Next up is revisions of Form 2C with Sabrina Trapp. She's going to drive herself, so I'm just going to stop sharing. And then Sabrina, you should be able to share now.
Thanks, Hannah. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you great. Thanks.
Okay, and can you see the slides?
I can. Thank you.
Let's see. Are you seeing my notes? Or are you
I
seeing...
am. Yeah.
I always get this wrong. Let's see.
I got you again.
Switch it. How's that?
That's good.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. It is still morning, right? I'm Sabrina Trask, the Senior Oil and Gas Location Assessment Specialist. And I know you just received a whole bunch of really detailed information, so I'm going to go super quickly through a couple of Form 2C updates that I have. I do just want to, hang on one sec here. Sorry, changing my screen so I can read my notes. I do want to give a grateful thank you to Jane Stanzik and Greg Duranlo for helping me with a couple of late nights over the last few nights working on these Form 2C updates. And a huge thank you to our very busy eForms developer, Ishan Lin, who has been just amazing in the amount of work that he's been doing in updating all of the existing forms and creating all of the new forms that we have. So really quickly, we have two new questions added to our Form 2C, which is the oil and gas development plan, certification, sorry. So two new questions have been added to this form. One of the questions is related to the duration of the public comment period. The other question is related to the duration of the CDPHE consultation period. So we realized that Rule 303D1A sets the duration of the public comment period for the entire oil and gas development plan based on the siting of each location. Normally, the public comment period will be 30 days, starting with the completeness determination, but for OGDPs that have any location within 2,000 feet of a residential building unit, high occupancy building unit, or a school facility within a disproportionately impacted community, the public comment duration will be 45 days from completeness determination. So what does that look like? On the Form 2C, on the Operator Data tab, which is the first tab on the form, there is a spot there for the CAP ID number, Comprehensive Area Plan number and name. We've added the two new questions just underneath that, so they should be pretty easy for you to find. The first new question that we've added asks, does this oil and gas development plan include any proposed oil and gas locations where the working pad surface is within 2,000 feet of a residential building unit, high occupancy building unit, or school facility within a disproportionately impacted community? The data field to answer this question is just a simple yes, no drop down. And so how are you going to determine, how do you get this answer right? You're going to need to look at every 2A that is associated with this OGDP, go to the cultural tab and look at the very last question on the cultural tab, in the first part of the cultural tab, for the data field that asks, what is the distance to the nearest residential building unit, high occupancy building unit, or school facility within a DI community? If this number that you've entered on your 2A is less than 2,000 feet, you will answer yes on the Form 2C on this question. So you'll have to look at all of these distances on all of the 2As. If any one of those 2As has a location less than 2,000 feet, you have to answer yes on the Form 2C for this question. If you answer yes, then eForms will establish a 45-day public comment period that is effective for all the proposed 2As within the OGDP. If you answer no, then the public comment period for all the proposed locations within the OGDP will be 30 days. And I just lost my clicker. Okay, so the second new question on the Form 2C is related to Rule 309A, which sets the duration for consultations. Normally, consultations includes consultations with surface owners, with building unit owners and tenants, with CDPHE, and with public water system administrators, if applicable. Normally, that consultation period is 45 days, starting with the completeness determination. But for locations that are partially or wholly within a disproportionately impacted community, the consultation period will be 60 days. Boy, I'm having trouble with my laser pointer. So what does that look like on the Form 2C? The second question here is located just underneath the first question, and the language is, does this oil and gas development plan include a proposed oil and gas location where any portion of the oil and gas location is within a disproportionately impacted community? This is another answer that's just going to be a simple yes or no drop down. And then how you get that answer, again, is going back to your Form 2As on the Cultural tab and looking for the data field where you entered the distance to the nearest disproportionately impacted community. Something to keep in mind here is that on the Form 2A, the measurement you provided in this box is actually measured to the working pad surface. The measurement we are looking for to answer this question is from the edge of the location itself. So that's going to include the entire disturbed area, which will include maybe your soil stockpiles or your stormwater controls, that sort of thing. So the numbers on your 2A in this box might not be exactly the exact number of the distance of the location to a disproportionately impacted community. If this number is 0, that means your location is within the disproportionately impacted community, and you would select yes for this, the answer to this dropdown. If your disproportionately impacted community number on distance on the Form 2A approaches 0, say it's 10 feet, you're going to need to look at the greater area of your location to determine if any of the location is indeed within a disproportionately impacted community. So if any of your locations are within the DI community, you will answer yes to this question, and that will set your consultation period to 60 days. If none of your locations are within the DI community, you will answer this question with a no, and that will set your consultation period to the standard 45 days. Keep in mind that the length of the CDPHE consultation that is determined on the Form 2A, when you go to the review tab and you can see all the different tasks laid out, that length for consultation will still apply for your consultations with surface owners, building unit owners, and tenants, and any situations where you would be consulting with CDPHE or with a public water system administrator. And I think that that's all that I have. Happy to take questions.
Sabrina?
Yes.
And so you and Ishan got all these changes made. Have these changes been deployed so that if I go and log into the Form 2C that I've been working on in draft, am I suddenly going to see these new questions?
I am not sure.
Okay.
Ishan and I were still chatting last night.
Testing, yeah.
10:30, 11 o'clock last night, trying
Okay.
to finish up the testing. I believe the testing has been completed, and I believe those two new questions should be rolled out today.
Right.
I will confirm that with Ishan.
Okay.
Yeah.
So everyone just, if they don't see it now, they'll see it probably by the end of the day on their forms
Yes.
in draft. Yeah.
And it looks like
So-
we have a question. Where do we find the data shapefiles of disproportionately impacted community boundaries? We are in the very, very, very final stages of testing our disproportionately impacted community layers on our COGCC GIS interactive map. Chris Eisinger has been working as hard as Ishan to get those layers built and properly vetted so that they work. I was actually talking to Chris late last night as well. We're hoping to have those layers active on our map by end of day tomorrow. That's a very likely goal for us. The data downloads that correspond with that data will also be available for download on our website at the same time that those layers are released. So I think tomorrow I'm going to stay with fingers crossed.
And stay
And-
tuned. I think those will wind up on the agenda. We'll walk through those at next Tuesday's operator presentation.
Okay, was that
Back
all
to
the questions?
back to
Okay.
CPW consultations. Are other consultation habitats provided in the interactive map that aren't listed in 1202C or 1202D habitats still considered high priority habitats for the purposes of responding to questions about HPHs in the forms? Yes. All high priority habitats, including those that are not in the subsets listed in 1202C or 1202D, are high priority habitats and should be addressed.
Is that all the questions?
It looks that way, Hannah.
Okay. I couldn't tell which ones had been answered and which ones had not been answered. Okay, great. Let me advance the slides to show you guys the next operator meeting proposed schedule or agenda. That's what we call it. And we'll see if any other questions come in the next couple minutes. But this is pretty much the end. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and we'll see you next Tuesday on the 2nd.
Thanks again, everybody, and thank
Thanks,
you
Hannah.
again, Hannah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Oh, and if you'd like to be added to the operator list, my email's up there. Oops. All right, I'll be signing off now. Take care, everyone. Meeting for all.